Good morning, everybody. My name's Heather Crawley. I'm director of the MIDEQ Hub, and it's really my absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'd really like to add my thanks to those of our international partners for their comments this morning and for their commitment to the work of MIDEQ, not just today, but from the beginning when we put together the idea for this work back in 2017, and when we really didn't know each other, either in terms of our relationship with the international partners or indeed within MIDEQ. And that partnership was really based on trust, and that trust has been vital to our success. So I'm very grateful to them for that. Before I introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Louis Herns Marcelin, for his keynote speech, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction to the Hub, which build on the remarks that you've heard about this morning about the Hub's work. If you want to know all the sort of technical details, if you want to know about what we've been doing, we've got a website, everything's there. What I wanted to do was really just to say a little bit more in general terms about the journey that we've come on and the work that we're going to be showcasing today, because I think it's true to say that when we started out on this journey in 2017, we could never have imagined sitting here with you today and with our online audience showcasing the findings of our work. Why could we not imagine that? Well, at that point in time, we felt that we wanted to do something really quite different, and we didn't know how, in a way, this was going to land in the international community, but also in terms of the academic research domain. We really wanted to build a new approach to thinking about migration, not just as much research has done by looking at migration itself, but rather by embedding our understanding of migration within broader processes of socioeconomic and political change and transformation. And in particular, inequalities, which, as you've heard this morning, really shape and limit the possibilities associated with migration. I know Herns is going to say much more about this issue of intersectional inequalities in his opening remarks, but I do think this idea that we had with MIDEQ to situate migration in these broader processes has been very important, but also taken us to places that we perhaps didn't expect and that were not predicted at the outset. I think the second sort of surprise, if you like, is in a way, it's not a surprise, but it's sort of manifested in a quite particular way, is that we really wanted to shift perspectives when we started off on this journey to looking not just at the relationship between migration, development, and inequality in the Global South in general, but specifically from the perspective of those living, working, and moving in the Global South. There is a very common perception that most migration takes place from the south to the north. We see a dominance of our media, of course, in Europe that reflects that. But at least a third of all international migration takes place between the countries of the Global South, and it's probably a lot higher than that because the nature of borders are different and the kind of recording of that is different. And that migration, as Federico has said, is likely to grow in the future, not least because the global north is making it very difficult for people to move. So we really wanted to ensure that we built on existing knowledge in the global south and that we allowed the research to develop in a way that was really driven by the ideas, the questions and the perspectives of our global south partners, who constitute by far the biggest proportion of our team of more than 100 researchers. So the research, I think, as a consequence, has developed and unfolded in ways that weren't originally known or expected. Some of the rich data that you'll be hearing about today, about the role of spirituality, about the nature of social relationship, about kinship, these are not dominant themes in much of the migration literature because it is coming from a different geographical and potentially political place. So I think our approaches are very genuinely interdisciplinary, and I hope that you'll really get to have a feel of that today. And the final point really I wanted to make is really about the policy environment and where our work will land. I think in truth there is a really desperate need for new thinking and ideas in the migration policy space. And I say this as someone who's been working on these issues since the late 1980s, when I was dealing with the so-called refugee crisis here in Europe, when we saw the forced displacement of millions of people as the former Yugoslavia broke up. 8 years later, we were undertaking research on another migration crisis, this time with the arrival of large numbers of people, mainly Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis across the Mediterranean. And just this week, and over recent weeks, there's been more talk of crisis and another deal to stop the flow. Migration has become a touchstone in Europe in terms of the kind of issues that it represents in the politics of Europe. And also more generally, actually, across the globe, migration has taken on that characteristic. And I think the consequence of that is that the focus is often on border controls and security rather than on the potential of migration. the movement of people has become a problem, as seen, or more specifically, the movement of poor Black people, because in fact, rich people, and especially rich white people, actually have unprecedented mobility. So there is a contradiction here about what's happening in the mobility space and how the inequalities are shaping the narratives around it. So we desperately need new thinking. We desperately need new ideas to help us harness the human potential associated with migration rather than seeing it as a threat. And we desperately need new ideas. And that's why we've gathered here today, and we hope you've gathered with us today for the same reasons, to think about what those ideas might be and how they might shift some of the discussions that we're having at the policy level. It also means engaging head-on with the racism and xenophobia with which migration is increasingly associated, not just here in Europe, but globally. And again, we'll have a panel specifically addressing that issue. So that's it from me for the moment. Without further ado, I really want to hand the floor to my esteemed colleague, Professor Louis Herns Marcelin. Herns is Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Miami. He's Chancellor of the Inter-University Institute for Research and Development, INURED, in Haiti. And you can read more about Professor Marcelin's extensive research experience and background in the online bibliographies that accompany the program. Herns has played a really critical role in MIDEQ, not just as co-director of the project and in leading the work in the Haiti-Brazil corridor, but also, I would like to say, as a great friend and ally in navigating the logistical intellectual challenges that MIDEQ has faced these past years, and there, for those of you in the know, have been many. Herns, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes to make your remarks, and then we'll have a brief exchange around some of the issues that you raised before we move on to the first substantive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. My intervention focuses on the whole challenge of addressing inequalities, addressing particularly intersectional inequalities from the perspective of the global South. So we know that it is now an accepted premise that the potential for migration to contribute to human development and deliver on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals remains unexplored. Exploring how migration can contribute to human development is an important yet contested endeavor, depending on how and by whom these issues are framed. So the SDGs provide a global framework aimed at addressing various socioeconomic and environmental challenges, and migration and its intersections with other entrenched sociocultural inequalities and inequities is an essential aspect of these goals. This policy symposium proposes to highlight and ultimately encourage stakeholders to address the intersecting layers of structural inequalities that both drive migration and limit its potential to contribute to personal, societal, and global development. So our reflections today are based on the 4 years of research undertaken by MIDEQ colleagues on contextual and regional modalities of migration, in which structural inequalities and inequities interconnect to shape the individual, household, community, national, and global scales of people's livelihood. By doing so, the presentation you will hear today will help institutions and policymakers better understand and tackle the root causes of inequality, both within and between countries. Collaboration between governments, civil society, including organizations of migrating populations, and local and regional community networks, multilateral and international organizations, and the private sector, is crucial to achieving meaningful and sustainable change. It is a complex and multifaceted issue that calls for a paradigm shift away from the common individualistic, fragmented, and short-term one-size-fits-all interventions that usually we take. So addressing intersectional inequality and inequities through migration requires comprehensive strategies involving a syntagmatic whole of governments and whole of societies approaches in synergy with international and regional organizations. To this I will come later. But first, I want to briefly outline the key parameters that framed our MIDEQ researchers and partners that frame their methodological framework, in their actions. First, for our MIDEQ colleagues, movement, mobility, and migration are fundamental forces that have shaped our history, societies, and communities and individual lives. And this point has been reinforced this morning. From the earliest migrations of hunter-gatherer societies to the interconnectedness of the modern world, human beings are defined by their capacity to move and adapt. So mobility, both physical and intellectual, has shaped cultures, societies, and the course of history. Our research in MIDEQ explores how mobility, movement, and migration are intrinsic to human experience and have contributed to the rich tapestry of our existence. Second, at the same time, we also acknowledge that movement, mobility, and migration are shaped by complex intersections of environmental, historical, sociocultural, political, and economic forces that constrain individuals, communities, ethnic and diverse groups at the global, national, and local levels, which in turn determine who is and is not mobile, who is or not able to migrate, and under what conditions. The third principle adopted by our colleagues in MIDEQ, despite those constraints and determinations, we embrace the premise that people on the move continue to produce and to be active agents in shaping the places and communities where they live and transit through. Migrating populations are not passive recipients of their host societies or communities' influences. They bring with them unique perspectives, experiences, and talents. We understand the population we studied as socio-cultural producers who shape the social, artistic, and economic landscapes of their host communities. These productions, as well as the agency of their producers, are expressed in languages through the arts, cultural events, festivities, pains and innovative social practices and celebrations and discoveries, etc. Understanding people on the move as active agents and producers shift our perspectives from migrants as reified substantive objects to people on the move with humanistic projects. Fourth, in MIDEQ, we also posit that the story of movement, mobility, and migration is better told by the actors and on the move themselves. In other words, we deepen our understanding of processes of migration when migrating populations tell us their stories in their own words. From where they experience mobility in their lives. In this sense, in MIDEQ studies, researchers have departed from the dominant approach of studying international migration from the global north theoretical methodological perspective, dominated by a macro-level approach, statistical modeling, national security prism, racialism, solely from the vantage point of the destination country, to foregrounding the voices and actions of people on the move from their home countries to successive destination countries and back to their place of origin. Of course, we learn from this body of literature and these policies lenses. We do understand that from states, governments, international and multilateral institutions standpoints, migration is often a matter of control, security, governmentality, and even public health. It is a political fact of life. We very much understand that for global powers, through the lenses of these structures, both in the global north and in the global south, the meta-colonial order must be defended through the dominant discourses of border security and racial containment generated by the science of migration and enacted by policymakers and decision takers. After all, as a Western thinker, so that clearly society must be defended. Here, our work questions the foundational premises that underlie this premise. I mean, that underline this framing of migration and people on the move. Moreover, migration from the MIDEQ perspective is seen as processes that can take many structural forms, from sending destination countries to circulatory form in which transitions and transits are key nodes in a complex network in and off movements. Embracing these premises, which is our fifth principle, have theoretical and methodological consequences, because placing people's multidimensional experiences of migration, their voices and concerns at the core of knowledge production on migration and vulnerabilities requires an approach that relies on transdisciplinary methodologies, whereby ethnography and other qualitative methods are combined with quantitative modeling, network analysis, artistic production to generate a more complex understanding of people on the move and their communities. And finally, MIDEQ researchers postulate that contemporary migration should not be studied in isolation from other dimensions of society, as most of the ivory thematic towers literature would have us to believe. Since migration is intrinsically a dimension of sociocultural life, its ongoing fragmentation in academia and policy circles into compartmentalized specializations and focuses obscure the richness inherent to it, as it is with any other social phenomenon we would be studying. As our colleagues panelists will accentuate in their presentations today, it is critical to acknowledge migration as part of a wider economic, social, and political process. Let's now turn to intersectional inequalities and its path dependency within and between societies in the Global South. Last year, I had the privilege to addressing the theme, Center Inequality in the implementation of the GCM at the last International Migration Review Forum. I noted that the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration is a necessary step in ensuring that the potential for migration to facilitate human development can be realized. However, for many nations in the Global South, tapping into this potential remains elusive. Policymakers, researchers, advocates, and other stakeholders disproportionately focus on South-North migration, interrogating processes such as inequality by comparing origin countries in the South against host countries in the North. However, global inequalities are often reflected of regional and local systems of inequalities and inequities that have relegated entire groups into a path dependency of complex vulnerabilities, the root causes of which have largely gone unaddressed. Most migrating populations are profoundly shaped by inequalities experienced at home that persist through the migratory process. Yes, we know that under the right circumstances, the potential for migration to contribute to human development, as codified in many in the SDGs, is tremendous. And many global policies, such as GCM, enshrine this vision on paper. However, in large part, due to entrenched complex vulnerabilities resulting from social exclusion, climate-related disaster, expanding marginalization, wars, human rights abuses, and violence, most populations in the Global South are stuck in communities depleted of any basic conditions for human life. And yet, these circumstances are the ones that determine who is and is not able to migrate, who enters these often expensive migration trails at exorbitant costs to their families, and engages in the risky migration journey that make up many of the corridors we have been studying. These circumstances who engages in orderly or these circumstances dictate who engages in orderly or disorderly migration movement, as well as the financial, social, and emotional costs of doing so. So this process of this process often condemns those with the least option to inconceivably treacherous journeys across land or sea. Some trek for miles, transiting through multiple countries, including jungle, desert, and communities that have built entire economies on the tenacity and desperation of migrating populations. Results from our studies suggest that we should also pay attention to the path dependency created by the societies and communities of origin where circumstances force people to choose those perilous migration routes. Those communities, and in many cases, entire societies, are the generators of vulnerable migrants, exposed to systematic abuse and exploitation. Two cases come to mind. In the case of the Americas, Haitian migration across South and Central America to the US-Mexico border epitomizes such complex processes and the continuum of intersectional inequalities and inequities they encounter on these trails. Inequalities often originate in the homeland where populations are vulnerabilized and exposed to systematic abuse and exploitation. In the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor, MIDEQ researchers documented the perilous journeys of Ethiopians from Adia to South Africa, crossing multiple countries and with undocumented status. Their rights unprotected and exposed to rising xenophobic violence. In such cases, migration is not necessarily the source of inequalities, but serves to exacerbate that. To advocate for safe, orderly, and regular migration, civil society organizations and state actors must reconcile the fact that migrant vulnerabilities in foreign nation-state borders are profoundly linked with the ones that shape their living conditions at home. It is our role as researchers to unearth these linkages through our studies. For this, we will need people-centered evidence. There is a critical need for us to generate people-centered evidence because safe, orderly, and regular migration is only possible if we understand migrant experiences in their totality. These experiences are more than statistics, trends, and modeling. We must place people on the move at the core of the methodologies and theories. So this effort we have done in what the MIDEQ teams in the Global South have accomplished through direct engagements with community leaders, bringing their concern to local and national stakeholders regarding their communities' pluriversal understandings, diverse views, and practices of mobility beyond the securitization and militarization of migrations at the state level. Those localized understandings and practices have been captured through multiple data sources, media, in various formats and languages, including through visual arts. They center in scientific and literary publications, biographies codified by individuals on the move, ethnographic network tracing, theater, music, to name a few. These are multidimensional efforts that provide our researchers the necessary conceptual tools needed to bring a new story of migration to policymakers and stakeholders in Ghana, Brazil, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Nepal, among other sites. These efforts have led to a reframing of the themes of core interest to migration policy, which are decision-making, gender, children, intermediaries, resource flows, access to justice and digital technology. Vulnerability during the migration process often begins at home, as I mentioned, signaling to governments and communities in the destination country that migrants are unprotected and can be exploited. UN member states have committed to promoting a humanistic and constructive public discourse on migration. This is a commitment that would help reduce injustices and combat violence, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance against all migrants. conforming with international human rights law. A whole of government and whole of society approach to ensure horizontal and vertical policy coherence across all sectors and level of governments requires multi-layer strategy that integrate different steps, including building capacity in the Global South at community, national, and regional levels for migrant protection, universal consistency in the visa regime, tangible and verifiable mechanisms of protections of migrant flows from the origin countries through transit and destination countries, and fostering civil society networks and government agencies' ability to monitor situations in which protection capacity is needed. Many countries now face the new reality of intense migrant circulation and population movement. In the context of the South-South migration, our work in MIDEQ has empirically documented this intensity through mixed methodologies, which integrate the humanities, social, and behavioral sciences in 6 migrating corridors within an interdisciplinary framework. These rich materials are now available for international organizations, partners, knowledge-producing institutions, and to inform migration governance in the Global South as well as in the Global North. This symposium is an invitation for you to take up the challenge of engaging new knowledge emerging from unconventional places. We must not be afraid to engage established institutions and the powers that be, notwithstanding the hegemonic forces of established and taken for granted narratives codified by institutions and the policies and politics that frame people on the move as migrant orders with no humanistic project. We shall not be afraid to engage governments, regional organizations, the United Nations and its agencies to create spaces for diverse voices, pluriversal views and practices from the bottom up. Our major challenge is not so much to speak the truth to power. Power already knows the truth. Our challenge is to create space for pluriversal voices not to be ignored by power. Thank you.
Thank you, Herns, for so eloquently capturing the essence of MIDEQ. You'll hear lots today about the detail, about the findings, about the ways in which we're trying to communicate this complexity that has been described. But I think this bigger picture of why we're trying to do this and how we think we need to engage people now in the findings of our research is really critically important. Thank you also for highlighting the structural drivers of migration. I think one of the dangers in the migration policy space, but also the migration research space, is we talk about these things as if they're somehow just happening, that people are just somehow moving and these things are somehow happening. But you used the phrase vulnerabilized as a verb. People are being made vulnerable by a whole series of processes, which includes very deep and exploitative capitalist infiltration into various contexts where systems have previously been different, changes to agricultural systems. These are profound system changes that are happening in the context of globalization. People are not just vulnerable, they are being vulnerabilized. And I think that's critically important because it also reflects back on the agency of individuals. And also thank you for highlighting the kind of policy dilemmas in a way, because we often rely upon, in a research sense, policy solutions. We want evidence-based policy making, and if we just give evidence to policymakers, it will somehow translate into something better. But those of us who have been around for a while know that evidence-based policy making is a very deeply political process, and certainly not a linear one. And also that policies can also be part of the problem, and they often are. And so just thinking we can just sort this out with a policy solution may be somewhat simplistic. So you captured a lot in your presentation. We have decided that before we have the coffee break, because the coffee break is coming in about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, what we'd do is just have a little bit of an interaction about some of the points that you raised. And I wanted actually to ask you some questions. I have three. I may or may not get to them all, but you noted in your remarks that policymakers and politicians have, if you like, failed to harness the potential of migration for development, even though it's very clearly specified in a lot of policy documents. And you referred to the countries of the Global South, but also to these global governance mechanisms like the Global Compact on Migration. So I have a practical question, which is, beyond us saying people need to think about these things more holistically and they need to engage with this different paradigm, what in practical terms could policymakers do to harness this potential? What could they or should they be doing differently? And you can take any level of policymaker that you like here, perhaps this audience or a country level audience or regional you mentioned, but what does this translate to into practical terms so that people in the room and online can take some ideas away with them about what to do next?
Thank you, Evan. And I think that one of the challenges that we face is not too much to understand these processes that make people, that vulnerabilize people, as we mentioned here. And of course, we need research, we need studies to, guide policymakers and people who are taking decisions about people's life. But I think one of the key points here is how do we engage those to whom these policies should benefit? What are the mechanisms that are created in order to, at the local community levels, national levels, regional levels, for voices of, organizations of people on the move, voices of civil society, voices of different sectors in, different communities, who are having stake in the challenges associated with people on the move. What do we do in order to incorporate them? In fact, my point here, when I mentioned the Global Compact of Migration, and when I mentioned, all the good work we do at the United Nations level, all the work that, the good intentions that we have in papers, my point is to orient our attention to the necessity of participatory process, to orient our attentions to the necessity of having people participate in things that we think that we are doing for them. How do we do that? We do that by imagining new ways of modalities of engagement of community-based organizations, by taking seriously what civil societies in the Global South and different groups in the Global South, in rural areas, organizations that are part, part of people's everyday life. We take these seriously and create mechanisms in order for us to translate those global ideas, those big ideas, into actionable ideas at community, national, and regional levels. That's the first point here. And I think that the second point here is that it's important for us to have a lot of declaration of principle, to have a lot of policies formulated in paper, but we don't have mechanisms of render stakeholders accountable to what they committed that they are going to do. This kind of accountability is fundamental. And that accountability comes also with participation. Because if what I promise it, in a public forum, in a public setting, and the public itself has a mechanism to remind me, this is what I promised. I am now in position power. What do? I end up doing it. The problem is that, again, as I mentioned in my speech, it's not too much to, enlighten power about what power should know. The problem is, how do we, engage the power that be in different types of relationships in which that people to whom or for whom these policies are formulated can be part of it. And that's the big problem that we face, not only at the global level, at the regional level, but also at the national level. In one way, we have scientists, policymakers, etc. We formulate, ideas that are very well, at time, grounded in research empirical reality, but at the same time, we are not able to translate them into operational activities because we don't involve people through their organization, through civil society, through the movement that they are doing. We don't take them seriously. Taking them seriously is the key point here that we are talking about.
Thank you. And Katja mentioned in her opening remarks that one of the unusual aspects of MIDEQ is that we have a significant number of what we call impact interventions using what is called in the jargon of our funder flexible funding, which means basically we enable our partners in the Global South to be able to undertake very concrete, specific activities which do exactly this, working with the local communities, but based on the research. And I think those impact interventions are a good, in a way, a good illustration, if you like, of the accountability of MIDEQ, because it's one thing for us to come up with ideas about what we think can be done differently, but we also have to test some of those ideas in partnership with the community to understand their veracity and whether they'll actually land.
So my point is that that approach that consists not only of generating knowledge with different paradigms framed differently, where we put the voices of the migrant or the people on the move at the center is critical, but also ways to engage people, through the precise network that has been created at the community and the national level. So what you said, we have experimented it in specific countries. The problem now is how to scale these things up.
No, completely. And as is always the case with a time-limited funding pot, that's the kind of thing that's, I guess, most pressing at our mind. And part of the reason why we're engaging a much wider audience in some of this work, because ultimately it won't be the MIDEQ team necessarily that takes it forward. It will be others who see value in the ideas and want to support it. My second question, I suspect it's the only one I'll have time for because coffee is beckoning. It's a bit of a kind of, it's an intellectual challenge, but also a practical one. On the one hand, we want to recognize the diversity of the people that move. We also want to acknowledge that they are people who are human beings ultimately at the end of the day and who are embedded in these wider social processes. But we also want to engage migrants. How do we navigate this challenge of wanting to, put migrants at the center of our thinking, but not migrantize them in the sense of suggesting that migration is the only important aspect of their life or identity? It's a real challenge for MIDEQ and other migration research projects. I'm just wondering, a very difficult question for you to answer in 2 minutes, but do you have any thoughts on how we, at least maybe we just acknowledge that challenge, but any ideas about how we might navigate it?
Yeah, first acknowledge this challenge is the first step. But navigate it is complicated. But one thing that is important here is we cannot continue to think about migration as if it was an exceptional phenomenon, that happened in social life. Migration is the dimensions of, different aspects of life. It cannot be studied without, for example, different, socio-political processes. It cannot be studied without understanding the transformation, the social transformation that is happening in rural and urban areas. It cannot be studied. In other words, the study of migration should be a lens for us to understand society, not to understand migration per se. Is that, we have been doing this exercise, the other way around. That's the first part. And this is a kind of conceptual shift that we need to make to understand that, migration is among other dimensions, economic dimension, political, socio-political dimension, etc., that happens in people's life. The second point is people on the move, as I mentioned in my speech, they have projects. People are not just moving just because they out of necessity. There are many configurations of things that explain why people move. Not long ago, I was discussing with colleagues in Burkina Faso. One of the key interesting points was that the whole idea of borders and how borders have crossed, through ethnic lines, family lines. People move for family reasons in many different ways. And yet the state project is to securitize those borders and to prevent people to be inhumans, to communicate, to organize their own lives and so forth and so on. So if we understand that people on the move, migrate, move, they are on the move. This is the fundamental nature of things. And if we place that concept at the core of the way that we approach the phenomenon we call migration, we will understand that people on the move, they have projects, and therefore they have organizing forms of their projects. So they have social organizations, they have political organizations, they have implications at community levels, they have communications, other implications at, regional level and so on and so on. So again, the point is for not to compartmentalize migration as an exceptional dimension, but it is an entry way for you to think about society in its complexity.